Hello and welcome to Furious Driving, and this is the third episode of living with an electric van as my, well, it's not exactly my everyday car because, as will become apparent, it can't quite do everything, but it's not that bad. So, last time I was speaking about this particular vehicle, I don't know if I came across as too negative perhaps, because a lot of people I think seem to now have the impression that I'm very anti-EV, which I'm really not. I'm just open to new ideas. I don't like things being overhyped though, and I like to try things for myself so I can see for myself if things really are as good as people say they are, or indeed as bad. There's one point of correction. When I picked up this van, I was told it only had slow charging, and I understood that to mean it only had 7 kilowatt per hour or watt hour charging facilities. It turns out you can actually charge it at 22, which is significantly quicker. Still not massively rapid, and there's another thing with that which we'll come to in a minute as well, because most of this episode will be about charging. So, the van itself. It's pretty good. It's car derived, which means it's got a lot more creature comforts than the Kangoo had. It's actually quite comfortable, and it's got lots of features like Apple CarPlay built in. We've got cruise control. We've got speed limiting as well, which is extremely handy, because one thing people say about EVs, oh my gosh, it's so quiet and so smooth. Well, it's pretty quiet, but the road noise does become a lot more apparent because there's no engine noise disguising it. However, because there's no engine noise, it's quite hard to gauge how fast you're going sometimes, and you are watching the speedometer all the time to make sure you're not breaking the speed limit. So having the speed limiter on there is actually quite handy. But I don't really want to be talking about the fixtures and fittings and the qualities of this individual van, because this isn't about that. I will do a separate goes for a drive review of the Zoe van fairly soon actually, to give you an idea of everything that's in this particular vehicle. And what I really want to talk about is the actual living with aspect of this thing. Now, nothing's changed as regards the charging front. I've still only got the 3-pin, the granny charger, which means from flat this will take about 13 hours to fully charge. So if I want to use it 2 days in a row, having completely depleted it, it means it's got to go on charge pretty much as soon as I get home, and then come off again the moments before I leave, and then I've got the full power. However, that has turned out to be pretty variable. I've been using it as much as possible. I've put a lot of miles in this thing now, so I've got a fairly good idea of what it's like in lots of different circumstances. But one thing that is quite confusing is what to expect in the morning when you go out and look at the battery range, because the best I've had out of it, which I think is more than it's even claimed to a range, is 248 miles of a full charge, which is quite spectacular. Today, fortunately, I'm not going quite as far as all that, but I left it on charge overnight and I came down to it and it had 201 miles with 100% charge. So you shouldn't necessarily be counting on the absolute maximum if you're planning a long journey. And I have done some long journeys in it. I think the most successful journey I've done was a loop which started off in sort of middle of Kent, went off to somewhere around junction 7 of the M25 into Surrey, and then down to the south coast, and then back up into Kent again. It was about 175 miles, and I only stopped for a few minutes to go and get an extra, like a bonus charge rather than a required charge. The remaining miles left on the counter at the end was exactly as I had predicted from when I'd left off in the morning, which is quite remarkable. That was a warm day and that was driving fairly conservatively. And also didn't use a massive amount of motorways, because if you use motorways then you find your range does diminish quite dramatically. You have to be driving sort of 65 miles an hour really if you want to get the stated range in this particular car. I have found other EVs are far more accurate, like the Kia Soul EV. That one is, if it lets you drive at motorway speeds and the projected range remains correct, which is good. But another day I drove this up to Bicester near Oxford, which is about 110 miles I think each way, and so I've managed to get 200 miles into the van. So I stopped off at an out-of-the-way charging point in the morning. I allowed an extra hour on my journey for charge time alone, and I didn't stop for too long, but I gave it an extra 25 miles before I left. Oh, a Sierra Estate, a Chasseur 1.8, very nice. But because I knew that still put me to basically 0 miles left when I got back, I stopped at every services between here and Oxford. But every time I got there, I found what is becoming very much a running theme of running an EV. There weren't enough charging points, sometimes only 2 charging points in the services. Every time, not only were they full, there were other cars waiting, so I've got to wait the 20 minutes to half an hour for the car in front to charge, then I've got to wait the 20 minutes to half an hour for the following car to charge. So I'm looking at maybe 40 minutes to an hour before I can even start charging. So I drove all the way to Bicester with no extra charge. Luckily I managed to find a charge at Bicester Heritage and get an extra 30 miles return journey, and on the way back I managed to hit Oxford services in a bit of a fluke with an open charger. And so that 220 or 230 mile journey was done okay. However, when I got back, it claimed it had 20 miles of free range left in it. Parked it, didn't put it on charge that night because I wasn't using it the next morning. The following morning though, I did move it into a spot where I could charge it, and when I went out to the van, it had got 2% charge left, 1 mile of range it reckoned, which was a bit of a shock. If I hadn't just been moving it from slightly along the road to the driveway, but had been planning to drive it to a charge point somewhere else, that would have been an issue, because when I parked it I had into double-digit charging, so that would have got me to an actual charger had I needed it. So yes, the battery efficiency, the battery expectations are an issue to be aware of, and the charging network is the other problem. Every time I've been to any charger anywhere, there's almost invariably a delay. I've now taken to going to charge points in motorway services just to look every time, even if I'm not in the EV. And every time I go there, all the chargers are full and there's always a queue waiting for them. So if my day would happily take me to home, to destination, to home again without an expected recharge, no problem at all, really fine. However, if my journey is longer than the car's anticipated range, I'm really often in 2 minds about whether I want to take this thing out, because I just can't guarantee I'm going to be able to charge it. And even if I can find a charger, they're often broken. In the middle of Maidstone, there is a bank of chargers right outside County Hall, the seat of local government, and they're EV-only parking spaces, and they're all broken. Another occasion I was in Sittingbourne and I didn't know where to get a charge from. I drove to a local Lidl because Lidls often have an EV charger in the car park. The one I drove past didn't, so I used Zapmap to find the nearest charger, and it was about another 10 minutes drive into the town. Finally found it, got there, and it was taxis only. So there's all these kind of problems that there aren't enough chargers, they're broken when you find them, there's always a delay with people queuing for them so you've got to wait and wait and wait, or you're just not allowed to use it at all. So the cars are good, the infrastructure isn't. That is something of a major problem. And that is something that will put me off having one of these as my only car, because any journey more than 170 miles, I really have to think very hard as to whether I'm going to take this or if I'm going to take the diesel Mercedes. Now, one thing I have found about this car is it makes you very, very conscious, not of your own driving, but of everyone else's, because to get the absolute most out of the battery, you have to kind of hypermile absolutely everywhere. So you're looking at gaps in the traffic a long way ahead, you're balancing your speed, rolling up to junctions and giveways, and looking further down the road to find that gap. So you never come to a full stop if you can avoid it. You don't scrub off too much speed if you can avoid it. You just keep on moving all the time, because it's accelerating is what kills the battery. So in order to avoid that, you just don't decelerate if you can possibly avoid it. And of course you look for hills where you can coast down and recharge for free. But what you do notice, or what I have noticed, is how bad most other people drive, how they don't look for gaps, how they don't look at what's happening ahead of them and react at the last moment, and are just so jerky and on off the accelerator and the brake. You're trying to drive smoothly and there are people stuttering down the road. That is quite an interesting thing you notice. You become very aware of how bad the general driving ability of the public is. Great. Well, I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting to get hold of a charge point here right now. but we can use it to talk about charging the car. So we've got three kinds of plug here: the big bad boy, the Chademo, and the one we're going to use in a second. So we're going to go in as a guest, accept the thing, swipe the card. Card has been detected. It takes a little minute. You can go in as a guest, it's cheaper, but then you have to have loads of apps. And if you're not on the network, or the network's down or slow, it's awkward. So we've got the 50 kilowatt charge DC CCS, we've got the 50 kilowatt Chademo, and we've got the 43 kilowatt Type 2. We're going to take a Type 2, but we're only going to get 22 kilowatts out of it. This does take a while. Okay, let's talk about running costs. Okay, a big selling point for EVs is the fact it's very, very cheap to run, or so they say. This is of course factoring in if you're buying a car and it's going to be buying a petrol car or a diesel car or buying an EV. If you already own a car, then obviously it's a lot more expensive because you're buying a vehicle as well. So anyway, I did a bit of a check on a website called Zapmap, which I've mentioned many times before because they are the database map of where all the charging points are. They've also got a comparison calculator if you're buying and running a car, an EV versus a regular car. So to look at this one, I've put into the Zapmap calculator a Zoe. The nearest Zoe they had, I think, was an 80 kilowatt hour battery, and it was a car, not a van, so you know, slight differences but fairly similar, versus the very similar Clio. And we're using 29p per kilowatt for electricity, because that's what I'm paying at home, versus £1.65 per litre, because that's what I saw in a petrol station this morning. Now, a 100-mile journey, they reckon in fuel would be £9.15 in the Zoe, or £17 in the Clio. So obviously a big cost saving in fuel, but not as big as it used to be. It was always made out to be massively cheap. Obviously the cost of electricity has gone up dramatically lately. Not quite sure how, because I thought the UK was taking a lot of power from renewables these days, which is of course a side argument for the making these cars as green as they need to be. They need to be getting their power from renewables to counteract all the nasty chemicals and metals in the batteries. So side argument there for another day. Anyway, what that calculates out to is that running this thing at £9.15 for that 100 miles is 9.2p per mile versus 17.3p per mile in the petrol Clio, which is a very, very similar car. If we're talking about my used Mercedes C-Class diesel estate, which is significantly larger, significantly more comfortable, got a much better radio, and is generally all round nicer to be in, the price is still £9.15 to drive in the Zoe, but it goes up to £19 in the Mercedes. So it's £2 more to drive a big comfortable estate over a small compact, well, basically town car. And so the difference there is 9.2p per mile versus 19.4p a mile, so about 10p a mile more. So in terms of running costs, there is a cost saving to be made. However, if you're buying the car on finance or a PCP lease deal, then you need to factor that in. So you need to really be looking very, very hard at how much it's going to cost you overall. It's not just the running costs of putting the fuel into it of some sort, it's the actual putting down several £1,000s as a deposit, the monthly payments, and then the balloon payment at the end to hand it back and lose your deposit or roll it into another vehicle. That mileage, by the way, on the Mercedes, that was based at £1.70 per litre of diesel, again because I saw that today. So if you're interested, £1.70 a litre equates to £8.50 a gallon. My Mercedes gets, give or take, 50 miles per gallon. So to do 50 miles in this, according to Zapmap's calculations, where a 100 mile costs £9.15, that makes it £4.75 to do 50 miles in this. So miles per gallon equation, bad maths, here we come. And using some very questionable mathematical equations, that works out at about 75 mpg equivalent in terms of cost. So it is better, but not as massively improved as people might have you believe. And that is, of course, all assuming you're charging at home using domestic rates. Now, my rates, because everything has gone crazy recently, has gone up to 29p per kilowatt at home. You may be on a better rate. You may be able to get like an overnight charging rate or an economy 7 rate where you can have your charge on a timer, so it doesn't come in until the cheap rate electricity comes in. Or if you've spent several £1,000s on solar panels, again, it's a situation where if you've got money to spend, then you can save money in the long run. Right here, up here, I am currently charging on Polar Network, where I believe at the rate I'm charging it's 39p per kilowatt, so it's 10p per kilowatt more than at home. However, it's massively faster than it is at home. Now, sometimes these things do display what price you're going to pay. This one today didn't. I did think I was charging for free outside Lidl for a while because I was tapping the app against the thing and no money seemed to be coming off. Then all of a sudden, one day after several days of charging apparently for free, I got a note saying that my credit had run out and I needed to top up my account. And so suddenly it seems to have charged money, which it hadn't been doing previously. So it's a bit confusing and there's so many variables, and not all the chargers are suitable for all the cars. This being the basic charger cable is perhaps the least frequently found cable, even though it's the most basic and you think the most obvious one. At Chobham Services, there's a bank of 6 big fast chargers. None of them can plug into it. There's a bank of another rival brand of 3 chargers, which is the most non-Tesla chargers I think I've seen in any motorway services, and only one of those 3 can accept this car to charge. Last time I went there was a car already charging. I asked the driver if he was going to be long. He said about 5 or 10 minutes. So instead of charging while I went to the loo and had a cup of coffee, I nipped in to use the loo, came out again, and he was unplugging as I got there. I don't know if he was being courteous and waiting for me to get back, or if it was just coincidence, because if he had driven off, someone else could have nipped in and nabbed my charge instead of me. But whilst I was charging, 2 other cars turned up and asked how long I was going to be, because everyone was desperate for that one charger, because another one was out of action, and another car, it was an old Leaf, had the same kind of charger as this. There's just not enough infrastructure. So my conclusion is the cars are good. The cars have reached a point of usability. However, the uptake of them has outstripped by a long way the infrastructure surrounding them. The argument against hydrogen is there's not enough infrastructure, and now it's getting to the point where there's not enough infrastructure for the electric cars either. It will need everyone to have charging at home. I would not be happy having to do a long road trip in this car, because yes, it can be done, but now with everyone else also jumping on the electric car bandwagon and charging up around the country, and around Europe in fact, it's suddenly becoming difficult. Although the chargers are spaced out enough that you can go a long way because you can find the next charger and get onto where you need to go, as well as your own charging time, you need to factor in a lot of waiting time, which wasn't a thing. I've been watching videos on YouTube of people doing road trips in EVs from a year, 18 months longer ago, and they're doing it, no problem. They're turning up, charging, driving on. If they tried that again today, I'm fairly certain, I'm probably going to get told I'm an anti-EV Luddite for saying this, I think they would struggle to get it done in a sensible time, because you would be spending so much time waiting and waiting and waiting at the charging points. There just aren't enough of them. Too many are broken. There just aren't enough. That's the main problem I have with them now. If your agenda is purely green, then these only partially make sense. Building a new car doesn't matter whether it's EV or internal combustion. It creates far more pollution. That is the vast majority. If you've got a car which is usable, the most ecological thing you can do is to maintain it well and keep on using it in a well-maintained state. If you've got a national fleet of several million cars, which every country has, ecologically, in the grand scheme of things, it's better to maintain those cars and keep them going until they naturally wear out, rather than artificially forcing them to be replaced by ULEZ schemes and stuff like that, which it seems crazy, because that's only reducing emissions on a severely local level. The power still has to be produced somewhere, and until our electricity is produced entirely by green means, which it won't be for a while yet, you've still got to produce it in another way, which isn't necessarily going to be clean. Right, so 20 minutes later, I've paid £3.30, I think it said on the screen, and I've gained 22 miles worth of range in the Zoe. Obviously, if this was a faster charging vehicle, if someone had sprung for the rapid charging option, I could have had a lot more in there. But, you know, they didn't. So I don't want you to leave this video with thinking I hate EVs and I think they're dumb and terrible and you can't use them. You can use them, but I think currently the limitation is the range of the vehicle you buy. You need to be looking at what your regular usage is and then pay for one that can drive that distance, and then be prepared to wait a long time for charging if you have to go beyond that distance. Currently, if I was to add an EV to my fleet of vehicles, I would have to factor in holding on to my old Mercedes and driving that for longer journeys, because, well, you know, this is great for going into the ULEZs, into town and that kind of stuff, but anything long way on the motorway, the Mercedes is currently better, unless you go and spring minimum £40,000 second hand for a longer range battery car. So there you go. So thank you for watching. Please don't go away thinking I hate these things. I just think they're currently, the cars are ready, but the world isn't. The infrastructure isn't there yet. So you're gonna have to buy one, get a charger fitted at home, and then assume that you'll be charging at home and only charging at home. Don't assume you'll be able to charge when you're out and about. So thank you for watching. I hope this has not been too negative, and I hope this has been in some way helpful or informative if you're thinking about buying one of these things. I wouldn't say don't do it, because yes, there is a lot going for these things. However, I would say look carefully at how you use a car and whether you could factor the charging and infrastructure problems into your daily use, whether you can just drive to and from home and charge at home. If you need to be doing long journeys of 200 miles, 250 miles or more regularly, you're going to have to spend a lot more or be prepared to do a lot of waiting. I hope this has been helpful. If you have, as always, like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. You know the drill. Take care, everybody.